Hey everyone, this is Erasmus with SoCal GG. I wanted to post a video about this graph and how new players could use this to maybe come up with some cool buff ideas for their troops. These are all the different blesses and buffs you could get. A couple of these, SOF, SOE is actually Strength of Flesh, Strength of Giants. I had to abbreviate them. Also, there's a couple I had to squish up here in this top graph. Liquid Body, Tempered Flesh. In any case, what these are your buffs and blesses. And these bars over here are the marginal utilities that you get by having more or less troops than your opponent. In this case, they are equal troops. So I know this is not going to say a lot on if you could break through a giant's regen threshold, or if you could beat some other particular part of the meta for like a Sacred Cav or a lot of the more in-depth counters to certain nations or players. But this could help give you a good generic idea. One thing to also pay attention to is some of these might fall off very much depending on how it gets matched up. Even though it says here we could gain quite a big advantage from something like Stygian Flesh, someone could take magic weapons, for example, and completely shut that down. So in either case, let's take a look at this and see what it means. Each column here is grouped in the percent of that marginal utility. You can see this is 17%, 44, 67, 83, 94, and some number closer to 100 than 94. These numbers here just basically show the window of roll advantage that you have. Rolling 6s and now 5s in advantage, 4 in advantage, 3, 2, 1. Now, massed means you've significantly outnumbered your opponent, 10 to 1 usually. Regular means it's a 1-to-1 fight, and SC would be something like a 1-to-10 fight where they outnumber you. The reason why there's such a big difference between these is because of how the open-ended 2d6 and the outliers produced from that could create large differences in the advantages. For example, having an SC or something that's outnumbered 10 to 1 produces significantly more likelihood of the enemy to be able to produce outliers that mitigate your advantages. So, looking at this graph as we're outnumbering them, we're on equal footing, or they're outnumbering us, let's take a look at some of the results that we got from this. A lot of these results I generated on Minitab, and for some of these I couldn't really figure out great ways to get them just via statistics alone. So on some of them, I used a Gaussian distribution with the standard deviation that I saw from test games to reproduce the results to see what kind of percentages we were getting. So what we could see here is when we are massed, or when we are 10 to 1, sorry, one more thing up here, tried to label blesses, spells. Limited means it only lasts for a very limited amount of time, after like a first hit or something like that. So take it with a grain of salt when you see them high up here, because you could lose them. Triggered means we need something else to go on, or maybe something else has to happen to it that might not be normal, but can happen very, very often. It's most likely to happen, but a slight disadvantage on triggering that. So in either case, let's take a look at these and what some of these results mean. We can see here a lot of these just immediately don't grant us that 17% advantage. Or they do grant us 17%, but they don't get us into the next big category. You'll see the colors I highlighted here. The bright green is sort of the sweet spot, I feel, for these regions. When you're outnumbering someone 10 to 1, a 44% advantage is going to be massive. Even 17 is going to be a pretty big deal, but this is that jump you get from these two by getting these two other die for your variants really adds up. If we look at regular in a 1-to-1 fight, this is kind of my opinion, and just from what I'm seeing with trying to reproduce this with unit routing, is a 67% advantage is sufficient to to win you a lot of these fights of equal footing, equal units. And then as SC, everybody wants to try shooting for as close to 100% as you can get. Stacking those bonuses onto an SC and protective bonuses, especially in the order in which they happen or resolve. There's some good notes on that I'll pin on here too. Really affect how they're going to survive, because you don't want to take an outlier when you're being 10-1 and get shut down by that outlier. So advantages such as these really tend to fall off because you're trying to take care of that worst case scenario that's going to hit you. Looking at this just as a fun thing to glance at, you could look at this yourself and get the same kind of ideas. A lot of the offensive buffs were not granting as high marginal utility as many as the defensive buffs were, and that's kind of across the board actually. And a lot of that has to do with you actually have to beat the results when making attack rolls, or you have to get a positive delta on the damage rolls. One thing that's also not considered on this chart is HP buffs. I can't really factor that in, as I'm considering these as hits more or less, and percentages and likelihoods of those hits are getting a positive delta on those damage hits. So I can't really factor in positive HP buffs here, unfortunately. And I can't really factor in something like if you're attacking giants with regen or other fancy stuff like that. A couple that really stood out to me was Swiftness and Fate Weave. Swiftness didn't really gain that much advantage, and I actually had to experimentally test this because I was wondering how much advantage you would get out of the First Strike ability, and it's actually not good, and it sometimes even backfires because the First Strike is based on using your total movement tile count in relation to the enemy's termination of their total tile count. Swiftness basically grants you a larger runway when you get more combat speed to land your first strike, so you could plan around it, but against players they could be very unpredictable and hard to come up with solutions for. Fate Weave also scored really poorly, and it just seems like it's very unlikely to go through its checks, and the bonuses you get from it seem fairly minimal, even in testing. A couple of these to pay attention to that I think scaled really well, especially for these two categories, is ×2 defense skill. Gets you in the 67 region for both massed and regular, which is pretty nice. It doesn't really do much for our SCs though. And a thing to consider on top of that is when getting harassment penalty as well. A lot of players like to talk about going for stat bonuses as opposed to some of these more hard effect bonuses that you could get with spells later, because these stack on top of that later. And I do agree with that, but as you can see, some of these really do gain some significant advantages in the right matchups. So I can't really say what's better or worse, but I could say there's some that did produce some decent results. I mean, Blood Surge was consistently doing pretty good. Even for SCs, it's still on the chart. And a comment I want to make regarding this is you don't just want to pick one and call it a day. Stacking multiple of these gets you into these other categories too, so putting them on top of each other really helps. The other thing I want to mention is you want to diversify those stackings. This doesn't show what they do when they're paired with one another. I recommend, statistically speaking, that increasing your defense skill as well as increasing your protection and your attack skill and the amount of damage you do is really statistically touching the gamut, and those are all going to push you really far into the upper categories when units are performing in a vacuum. There's a lot of other important things to this, like I said, like breaking damage thresholds of particular units, but it's just something interesting to note on where you might be able to get to these other categories even quicker on blesses or buffs you may have not really thought So hope you guys enjoy this and check it out and have fun testing.